I just received a word from Betsy that people are there. Uh, Dustin Brown is going to start it off is ready, so I think we're going to begin this. I'll ask Betsy to say a few words before we get going.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. We have a little hybrid event. David is virtual. And I think he will introduce the speaker, and if anyone else wants to say anything, you can go up to the podium, or you can come here and speak as well, and we're recording the event. So thank you for coming.
Yeah, I want to thank everybody who is there to remember our fallen colleagues and to the people who put together the program, particularly the staff at PA and in particular Betsy, everybody else who chipped in really did a great service. We're going to be remembering 10 people this evening. The session lasts an hour and a half, so we have approximately 9 minutes per person. And we'll start off with Ron Cosman being remembered by, is it Dustin Brown?
Sure. So I'm representing the Mississippi State University Social Science Research Center on behalf of Ron Cosman. So Ron Cosman died on Saturday, October 14th, 2023 at Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis after a 2.5-week battle against pneumonia that was COVID related, which he contracted in a routine trip to the dentist. He was born in Fort Lauderdale, Florida on September 13th, 1955. He's the only child of Shirley and Harold Hack, Edward Cosman. After graduating from Nova High School, Ron attended the University of South Florida, where he earned a Bachelor's of Arts in Mass Communications and Political Science. He's especially proud of his time working on Robert Graham's gubernatorial campaign. And then it was during his first stint in college, he took a job as a concert photographer, combining his lifelong loves of photography and music, and that actually kind of parlayed into other things later in life. He was an avid attendee of Burning Man. And when he would go, he would always joke at the meetings at the SSRC, and he would say, you know, I'm going to take a census there, and I think he was kind of serious. And I remember thinking to myself, there's no way that's going to be accurate, you know, but there's just no, but anyway, that was just kind of his kind of thought process there. Where was I? He then went back to school in the 1990s. First, at the University of North Florida, where he earned a bachelor's degree in economics, followed by a master's degree in demography and population studies at Florida State University. He earned his PhD in geography in 2001 from the University of Colorado at Boulder. His dissertation focused on clusters of inequality in U.S. metropolitan areas, and he kind of continued that research line for many years afterwards. He did a lot of things in urban-rural mortality and urban-rural health disparities, especially mortality disparities, with his colleagues at MSU and former students, like, you know, did a lot of work along those lines. He served as a research professor at the Mississippi State University Social Science Research Center from 2001 until he retired in 2002 as a full professor. And then he was granted research professor emeritus. He was president of the Southern Demographic Association in 2014. Ron and his colleagues secured over $4.2 million in research grants and contracts, providing much needed funds for major contributions in education, rural health, and the well-being of children, among others. He not only impacted the field, but he also cared about his local community. So he wrote grants as a member and president of Starkville in Motion, an advocacy group for kind of sidewalks and other kind of infrastructure in the community, for bike lanes and bus lanes and things like that in the community. So he had a huge impact on the Starkville community in that respect. He is survived by his wife Shelley, his mother Shirley Ann Barrell, his uncle Ronald Ty Spangler Jr., several cousins, his mother and father-in-law Sharon and Dave Rollo, his sister-in-law Melissa Norris, and nephews Liam Norris and nieces Cassandra and Amelia Rose Norris, and many friends who miss him dearly. He was preceded in death by his father and stepfather William Bill Barrell.
Thank you, Dustin. Is there anybody else who wants to say anything in regard to Ron? Okay, if not, I will, since I knew Ron very well and we co-authored several articles. He was a treasure to be with, and it was always exciting when he'd be in his backyard and say, I've got to put on my thinking cap. And he literally would go get a hat and put it on his head when we were discussing projects. So Dudley and I both knew him well among the people who were here, and so he's somebody we'll really miss. Our next speaker is going to be Terry Hall, who I believe is present.
This is Shelley. Can I say something really quick?
Yes, please, Shelley.
Oh, yeah. So I was Ron's wife, and I did want to mention that his mom's last name is Burrell. Also, I just wanted to mention that we're going to be honoring Ron in Starkville. He was instrumental in putting together the Lynn Lane path, the bike walk path in Starkville that he very loved. And so I'm working with Parks and Recreation, and we're going to dedicate a bench, a special area in his honor for all of his work with Starkville in Motion.
Well, that's a nice honor on behalf of Ron. Gary, I believe we're ready for you.
Okay, thank you. I'm speaking on behalf of Ruth Dixon Mueller, who died on June 15th, 2023. I'm reading her obituary, which was published on June 16th, one day later, from which I assume that she wrote it herself. Ruth was a fierce individualist. She brought her life to a voluntary close on June 15th at Pegasus Association, a Right to Die organization in Basel, Switzerland. The choice to end her life at age 85 while she was still capable of doing so was on her own terms, and it was to her a joyful affirmation of life. She was immensely grateful for the opportunity to do so peacefully. Ruth was a rebel in her family. She attended art college rather than university against the advice of her parents. She thrived in the tumultuous years of the 1960s in Berkeley, earning a BA, MA, and PhD in sociology at University of California. Although her marriage did not survive the 60s, her academic and early feminist aspirations blossomed. And in 1970, the sociology department of the University of California, Davis, hired her in an affirmative action program. Progressing through the ranks to full professor and department chair, she taught at Davis for 18 years. With special interest in South Asia, her demographic and policy-based research, writing, and consulting activities span the themes of women's employment in developing countries, marriage formation and dissolution, fertility and family planning. The sexual and reproductive health and rights of girls and women were a major theme in all of her work and teaching, and she was involved in the politics of population policies, including the Cairo Conference. She authored many articles in professional journals and reports for the UN, WHO, ILO, and for the International Women's Health Coalition, where she worked closely with Adrienne Germain. In IWHC, Ruth and Adrienne wrote a classic article on the Stalking the Elusive Unmet Need for Family Planning, in which she reminded demographers that family planning unmet need was far more than the original formulations by some of her more technocratic colleagues. She resigned from UC Davis in 1988. In 1992, she left a 15-year marriage and moved with the Swiss-born Martin Mueller, and moved to Costa Rica with a friend. She lived there for 18 years, growing coffee for the local market and organically certified pineapples for export. Still writing and consulting, she moved back to California in 2010 and for one semester taught a graduate seminar in population policy in the demography department at UC Berkeley. In 2015, she received the Harriet B. Presser Award from the PAA for sustained and distinguished contributions to research on gender and demography. At the time of her death, Ruth had moved from a houseboat in Alameda to St. Paul's Towers, a senior living community in Oakland. Residents there knew her as the chair of their end-of-life planning committee, a topic she had published on and pursued with special interest. Following her 2017 book, Passing On, that analyzed concepts of fairness in inheritance bequests. In 2021, she published an essay on end-of-life choices at a URL that you can get from her writing. She leaves friends in many places, as well as her sister, 5 nieces, nephews, and their partners, children, and grandchildren in Canada and Australia. Her words are published in the Legacy website, which I think all of us who come to these meetings are increasingly familiar with. Thank you, and I
Jerry,
would
thank you
hope
very
that-
much. Is there anyone else who would like to say anything on behalf of Ruth? Well, again, thank you. Before moving on, I'd like to say I appreciate the fact that she was a rebel. It's always good to hear in people. Next up is the remembrance of Dick Forstall, who worked for the Census Bureau. Cam Gibson put together a set of reminiscences about Dick, and I'm going to read them to you. This is quoting from him, so when I say I, it's not me, it's Cam Gibson. I first met Dick in the early 1970s when he left his position at Rand McNally in Chicago to work at the U.S. Census Bureau. My recollection is that Meyer Zitter, then chief of the population division, had recruited Dick primarily to take the leading role in working with OMB on the official definitions of metropolitan areas. It quickly became apparent that Dick and I shared common interests, going back to our childhoods, in the populations of cities and how they'd changed over time. While my interest was limited to U.S. cities, Dick had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of cities and metropolitan areas worldwide. Dick was a true scholar and worked with great attention to detail. I always appreciated his substantive comments on my drafts of reports or journal articles or papers for professional meetings. He typically provided editorial comments as well, much more than I thought was warranted. But the fact was he wrote extremely well, and I accepted nearly all of his suggestions. From the time Dick retired from the Census Bureau in 1995 until 2020, when I moved to Colorado, we typically got together for lunch once a week in Alexandria, usually at the Tempo restaurant or Clyde's, followed by a walk. In retirement, Dick worked hard at organizing all the materials that he had accumulated in the course of his career, but my impression was that he had a very difficult time getting rid of anything. One day at lunch, perhaps 15 years ago, Dick pulled out a handwritten letter that I had mailed to Rand McNally when I was about 14 years old, asking for some information about maps. The letter had been passed on to his office for response. I, of course, had no recollection of writing the letter or receiving a response. Who, except Dick Forstall, would still have these papers half a century later? I treasure my friendship and conversations with Dick over the years, and am thankful that he lived a long and rewarding life. I believe Dudley Poston wants to say a few words too about Dick.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, David. I first met Dick Forstall in the mid-1970s. I was on the faculty at University of Texas, and Dick came as to give one of those Friday luncheon talks. He was a very good friend of Harley Browning's. Harley and Dick had spent some time at Berkeley before, in the 60s, while Dick was still at Rand McNally. Anyway, Dick, it was sort of suggested in the comments that David Swanson just made. Dick was known for his expertise about metro areas. In fact, some of us used to call him the Calvin Beale of metropolitan areas. You all remember Cal Beale knowing everything about rural areas, every place possible. One time, so Dick was at UT to give this talk, and I had a party at my house with faculty from all different departments. And Dick was meeting with them, talked to one for a long time, then he talked to another one for a long time. And when it was all over, the next day, this one fellow from Miami said to me, "Boy, I'm sure glad you brought that guy in from Miami. He knows everything about Miami, where the freeways are. He knows everything about Miami." I said, "Listen, he's from Alexandria, Virginia. He knows hardly anything about Miami, but he studies the metro areas." And then a second person came up to me, I think a faculty member from the English department, and said, "I'm from Cleveland, and I just met this friend of yours, and I'm pretty sure he's from Cleveland." He knew everything about Cleveland. I said, "No, that's Dick Forstall. He knows a lot about a lot of metro areas." Okay, quickly, the second point I want to make about Dick Forstall is lots of you, or I suspect, although I can't see the people in the audience there tonight, but I suspect some of you maybe have some ties with the Southern Demographic Association. I know David Swanson does. In the late 1970s, early 1980s, the SDA was then known as the SRDG, Southern Regional Demographic Group, and we didn't have any bylaws. So one day, Ann Lee and Gladys Bowles and myself and maybe one other person spent a whole day writing the bylaws, but we set them up in such a way that there had to be a permanent member of the supervisory team from the state of Virginia. And of course, Dick lived in Alexandria his entire life, so he was on the SDA board of directors year in, year out, never elected, of course, because he was representing the Southern Demographic Association, the official person who was on all the time. Dick Forstall was a very pleasant fellow and fun to be around. And as David mentioned, he lived a long life, but he'll be missed. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Dudley, for the remembrance of him. Next, we have Mark Fawcett. Pardon me if I slightly choke up. He was one of the too many early deaths. He'll be remembered by David Brown, and I'm sure Dudley and others who were associated with him at Texas A&M will probably say a few words afterwards.
Actually, this is David Brown. I'm talking about Glenn Fugate. I think Amber Crowell is going to memorialize Mark Fawcett.
Yeah, that's what I thought I said, Mark Fawcett.
But
it's okay. I'll just go ahead. Good evening, everyone. I'm Amber Crowell. Mark's former student, his mentee, collaborator, colleague, co-author, and friend. I met him as an undergraduate in 2007 when he was running the Research Experience for Undergraduates program at Texas A&M with Dudley Poston and Rogelio Saenz. I didn't know graduate school was a possibility for me, but by the end of those 8 weeks, they had me fully convinced that a PhD was in my future. Mark passed away in the early morning of June 21st, 2023, the first day of summer, after weeks of fighting infection from complications due to heart surgery. We're all still trying to make sense of it. My friend Bethany DeSalvo, I don't I don't know if she's in here yet, but when I told her how late at night this memorial was, she joked that Mark would have never made it because he was notorious for going to bed very early, and this would have cut into his beer time. After I got my faculty position, PAA became the one time of year I could count on to see Mark, and I very much looked forward to it. We never really had much of an agenda. We said we'd get work done, but we didn't really know what that was. But we were sure glad to see each other. At PA last year, he was recovering from his heart surgery and texting us photos of his scar. We had a paper on the program, and I texted him before the session started, reassuring him that I would blame any problems with the paper on him. He said that was perfectly okay with him. Afterwards, I told him that the presentation made his rivals cry and leave the room. That was the funniest part, because in truth, Mark never really had rivals. He was too kind, too generous, too grounded and funny and friendly to have rivals. He was born on December 17th, 1953 in Aransas Pass, Texas. Mark received all three of his college degrees from the University of Texas at Austin, including his BA in 1976, his MA in 1980, and his PhD in 1983, all in sociology. He began his academic career in 1983 as an assistant professor of sociology at Louisiana State University. In 1986, he moved to the University of Texas at Austin, where he served for 3 years as a research scientist and director of data services at the UT Population Research Center. In 1989, he moved to College Station, Texas, where he joined the faculty of the Department of Sociology at Texas A&M. Mark remained on the TAMU faculty for 34 years until he passed. Over the last decade, we got to see Mark reach the heights of his incredible career, which included establishing the Texas Federal Statistical Research Data Center and its consortium of universities at Texas A&M, and being its founding director, being named a Cornerstone Faculty Fellow in the College of Liberal Arts, supervising a number of truly excellent students, some of who are in this room, serving as president of the Southern Demographic Association in 2017, and eventually talking about retirement, which he was prepared to begin just before he passed. Mark mentored me through graduate school until he hooded me at my doctoral graduation in 2014. He continued to be my mentor, and at that point one of my dearest friends, and my co-conspirator in all things research, as I went on to serve as a postdoc at the Texas Research Data Center, which he led on establishing, and I later joined the faculty at Fresno State. I'm laying out my career path here because one thing Mark clearly devoted himself to was seeing his students succeed. He was very committed to his students. He was always cheering me on, convinced I deserved opportunities, and that I was the perfect person for them. He was always encouraging me and reassuring me that I was smarter than I thought. And whenever any of us asked for a few minutes of his time to get his advice, or just hear him say that he liked our ideas, he would give you 2 hours. Anyone who's ever reached out to him for help or ideas knows this. There is no such thing as a short conversation with Mark. He was generous and supportive, and if you let him go on long enough, it would eventually be seminar time, which is when we'd head on over to the bar for beers and less serious conversations. Mark had an unshakable commitment to do good research. He was an inexhaustibly curious and brilliant scientist. He was determined to uncover true answers, and he would not accept results that were not entirely bulletproof. Sometimes this led to projects carrying on for years as he tested a measurement or a model from hundreds of different angles, but what would result was a quality of work that laid a solid foundation for others to build on. Those efforts are what culminated in his 2017 book, New Methods for Measuring and Analyzing Segregation, which provided the methodological framework for research to come. His book laid out in great and meticulous technical detail the flaws in those segregation index scores, and more importantly, the perfect solutions that he had developed. Mark was an impeccable scholar. He never boasted, but we can imagine that what he would be most pleased about was not how smart he was, but how his work helped others. Nothing got him more excited than an idea that would make research better for everybody else. That included his elegant solution to the problem of segregation index bias, his techniques for agent-based modeling of segregation, the establishment of the Texas Statistical Research Data Center at Texas A&M, multiple cycles in the Undergraduate Summer Research Institute to build a pipeline to bring students of color and first-generation students into graduate school, and his bottomless energy for students who got to be an integral part of all of it, including me. I think anyone who knows Mark, knew Mark, is incredibly grateful to have known him, and we're all lucky to have had that experience. And now I will make space for other people to talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Amber, for remembering Mark. One thing I've heard about him, but I can't speak directly to it, is that he was one of 3 people I know in the PAA who was a surfer, the other 2 being Griff Feeney and Jeff Taman. Dudley, I think you would be the next person to speak on behalf of Mark.
Okay, thank you, David. I was Mark's teacher at University of Texas and his colleague at Texas A&M University. I first met him in 1977, and I taught him, I believe, either his first or his second demography class. And in those days, and I also supervised his master's thesis, which Amber mentioned that he had received in 1980. In those days at UT, we had these pages that you would write down the student's name and then put the grade on the sheet. And I actually found the page that I have Mark's grade. He received an A in the class, I'll tell you that. But the funny story I want to tell about Mark is that he was instrumental in recruiting me to leave Cornell and come to Texas A&M in 1992. And then in the year of 2017, I retired from A&M and moved to a half-time basis, which is what Mark wanted to do this coming summer, was go to halftime and be half-time at A&M for a couple of years. So I moved to San Antonio, where I live now, and twice a week I would drive over to College Station with my wife, and we would take a hotel at the Embassy Suites Hotel, right up on, people knowing College Station is right on the corner of University and Texas streets. And they had a happy hour every night that if you had a hotel key, you could go to the bar and have free drinks for sometime for 2 hours, beers and wines. And I would do that, and Mark would come in because I was there for 2 nights, and then I went back to San Antonio. But Mark would come either one night or 2 nights and have drinks, and they were free at the Embassy Suites. But I would always, when I went to go home on Thursday, and I wouldn't be back to the following Tuesday, I would always drop by Mark's office and give him my hotel key. And then he would take that hotel key to the Embassy Friday or Saturday or Sunday, and he'd be able to get free drinks. Mark was just an ideal person. Everybody liked him, and he died much, much, much too early. He'll be sorely missed. He was just a wonderful person. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Dudley. Would anybody else like to say anything on behalf of Mark? If not, David Brown, are you ready to talk about Glenn?
Yeah, but I'd like to say, I've now found out why Dudley left Cornell for all that free beer in Texas. Okay, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to share some memories of my friend and mentor, Glenn Fugate. Glenn passed away in January of this year at the age of 96. I'd like to note that I prepared this presentation in consultation with my colleagues, Dan Lichter and Ken Johnson, who also were very close to Glenn. Glenn was an emeritus professor of community and environmental sociology and sociology at the University of Wisconsin, an affiliate and founding faculty member of the UW Center for Demography and Ecology, and former director of the UW's Applied Population Laboratory. Glenn was born in 1928 in Clearwater, Florida, where his father was the superintendent of the Pinellas County school system. Glenn enlisted in the Army at age 17 and served in Italy. Upon returning to the U.S., Glenn enrolled in the University of Florida, where he obtained a bachelor's degree in chemistry. He also met Martha at the University of Florida, and they were married in 1949. Glenn and Martha were married for over 74 years until Martha's death in 2023. What a tremendous marriage they had. Glenn's segue from chemistry to social science began in his senior year with the arrival at the University of Florida of the distinguished demographer T. Lynn Smith. After earning an MA in sociology under Smith's direction and with Smith's encouragement, Glenn and Martha moved to Madison, Wisconsin, where Glenn entered the PhD program in sociology. At UW, Glenn worked with Douglas Marshall, a demographer whose experiment station appointment involved demographic and statistical analyses of social and economic change in Wisconsin. Many of these analyses revealed geographic differences in development and well-being across the state. They planted the seed for Glenn's career-long interests in spatial inequality, internal migration, urbanization, and population redistribution. It was through this experience that Glenn developed his career goals of combining fundamental social scientific research with applied demographic analysis. After receiving his PhD in 1956, Glenn was appointed assistant professor of rural sociology at UW in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. For nearly a half century, Glenn, his PhD students, and close colleagues such as Calvin Beal and Kenneth Johnson defined the subfield of rural demography. His work focused on chronic rural population decline, rural-urban migration, residential preferences and population redistribution, the socioeconomic transformation of the U.S.'s rural population. His earliest work disproved the notion of the dying small town in America. He was an early adopter of Markov chain applications in the study of population dynamics, and he was an early user of large-scale aggregate-level public databases to conduct comparative historical analysis of socio-demographic transformations of communities along the urban-rural hierarchy. In the 1970s, Glenn and Calvin Beal first identified the so-called rural population turnaround, which marked the reversal of long-standing patterns of population concentration in the nation's urbanized areas. Later that decade, this and other research helped to frame Glenn's contribution to the report of the President's Commission on Population Growth and the American Future. Other notable work included a series of influential studies co-authored with James Zeichus on residential preferences and population redistribution. It showed strong preferences for living in rural and small town areas, especially those with easy access to larger places. His 1988 paper, co-authored with Dan Lichter, Monitoring the Metropolitanization Process, stimulated a flurry of research on metropolitan reclassification that continues to this day. In 1989, I had the honor of co-authoring a major census monograph on rural and small-town population change with Glenn and Calvin Beal. Glenn was an active member of PAA, RSS, and ASA. He was elected president of the Rural Sociological Society. He served as the first president of the International Rural Sociological Society. He chaired his department at Wisconsin twice and was a founding member of USDA's Multi-State Research Committee on Rural Population Dynamics. Glenn helped to establish Wisconsin's Applied Population Laboratory, thought by most people to be the most effective and impactful unit of its kind in the nation. Glenn was a committed teacher and mentor. He taught intermediate statistics to generations of Wisconsin graduate students. If I close my eyes, I can still see him flipping coins when he was talking about probability, which drove the students crazy. Near the end of his life, Glenn commented to his daughter, Gail, that his students were his proudest professional accomplishment. Glenn advised generations of PhD students who have continued his work in rural demography. served as presidents of scholarly societies, including the PAA and RSS, edited major journals, including Demography and Rural Sociology, served as deans at major universities, chaired academic departments, and directed research and outreach institutes. He was a phenomenally impactful advisor. He was especially proud that 3 of his students, Max Pfeffer, Dan Lichter, and I, served together as full professors at Cornell University. Glenn set the bar for mentoring PhD students. He was rigorous but empathetic, patient but demanding, even-handed and loyal, both during graduate school and after. In his own work and in the work of his students, he was insistent that all claims be supported by empirical evidence and that speculation was just that and should be clearly labeled as such. He was a role model that many of us tried to emulate with our own students. In fact, my students consider Glenn to be their academic grandfather. Glenn was a humble, generous, loyal mentor and friend, and I miss him. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Is there anybody on site or virtually that would like to say a few more words about Glenn?
I would. This is Marta Tienda. I was an assistant professor at Wisconsin when Glenn was department chair. He was not the person who hired me, but he was the person who was chair when I was promoted. I do not know what Glenn saw in me, but he decided that I needed to be promoted early. He was a great champion. And I can still remember many of his guiding words at a time that I didn't believe in myself, but he believed in me, and told me and said, Marta, you don't need to do it all today. Pace yourself. It'll still be there tomorrow. Glenn was a great supporter in his very genuine, unique way, and everything David Brown said about him as a mentor, I benefited from as a young assistant professor who was trying to find her way in a field that was very new. And I am deeply indebted when I saw his name on the list as someone who was passed. Both he and Martha were dear friends during the time that I spent at Wisconsin. He will be dearly missed by the association, multitude of students he mentored, but also many junior faculty whose lives he inspired in ways that he could never imagine.
Thank you, Marta.
I'm Ken Johnson, and I was not one of Glenn's students. The first time I met him, he and Calvin Beal and Thomas Ford from the University of Kentucky were sitting in the front row when I gave my first talk at PAA. And I had cited them together probably 50 times in my dissertation, so imagine how that felt. But Glenn and I became colleagues. He encouraged me. I was teaching at the time in the middle of the city of Chicago, studying rural America, not exactly an appropriate combination. So he mentored me. He encouraged me to be part of the multi-state research projects that David mentioned. And eventually we published several articles together. And I once said to his wife, I wish I had been one of Glenn's students, and she said one of the nicest things she's ever said to me. She said, Ken, he thinks of you as one of his students. So.
Thank you, Ken. Are there others? Before I move on, I want to remind people that this is being recorded and a video will be made available, or some type of recording of the whole session. So if you're interested in having a record of it, contact Betsy. Next, we have a tape that's going to be played. It's in memory of Dean Judson, another person like Ron Kosman I knew quite well. And it's done by Ludi Simpson from the University of Manchester and some of his colleagues. Betsy, if you would please tee that up and play it. Thank you.
Hello, this is Ludi Simpson, Bradford in the UK, in the University of Manchester, speaking for Dean Judson, who passed away far too early in his 50s. He's remembered for his groundbreaking statistical demography in state and federal settings, but above all for his delightfully challenging, frank and fun conversation, as an ally and a loyal friend of very many of us. Dean, with a PhD from Washington State, started groundbreaking estimation methods at the State of Oregon Employment Department in 1993, and with Chuck Sigmund, their demographic work created population estimates by age, race, sex, and Hispanic origin, the ARSH estimates, which informed Oregon trailblazing expansion of Medicaid, and were themselves a standard bearer across the country. Dean was Nevada state demographer, which was when I first knew him at Census Bureau gatherings of local demographers. He had children Claire and Wesley with Anita. And later he was the senior statistician at the Census Bureau, a statistician at the Office of Immigration Statistics in Homeland Security, and in the National Center for Health Statistics. He became self-employed. He traveled for 5 years with his second wife and long-term partner, Carol Popov, who survives him. Dean was at the cutting edge of statistical development with population estimates based on administrative records of many projects known by their acronyms such as ADREC and STARS, and resulting in the PSIS for the 2020 census. When I reconnected with him a couple of years before he passed, he was proud of his work on estimating from surveys the foreign-born population and its legal status. But for those that remember him as a friend, this incomplete record of professional contributions is one part of the man. Dean could be, in his own words, a little lonely and worried about the world, while equally engaging intensely with life, putting his constant curiosity not only into a scientific framework, but through philosophical inquiry and conversation. If sharing our experiences gives us greater hope of survival, then Dean pursued that art. He loved the interchange of views. He was also a legendary game player, ultimate frisbee, poker. He taught my young children Texas Hold'em and left them with a fine poker set. In his last year, he was learning guitar and learning chess. He set up games between friends so that he could follow them. In December 2022, he collapsed during the night and never recovered. He left his body to science. Dan Martin and Dean were statisticians in the Office of Immigration Statistics, and I'm handing over to Dan to share his memories.
Our friend Dean left us too soon and has left us with an empty space in our hearts. To me, he was there. For the 12 years I knew him, he was there. I enjoyed sitting with his wife, Carol, and him, discussing philosophy and metaphysics alike, laughing and learning. Him and Carol were often the only ones I could talk to about the high-minded stuff. About meditation practices, books we read, movies we'd seen. I remember him never wanting to miss a moment, kept notes on our chats, and referenced them at different times. He was there and he paid attention. It's why I loved his company. Like many friends, there were years where we didn't speak, but when we came back together, it was as if there was no separation. Even now, it feels as though he might just email at me and ask what's up. He left so quickly, it's hard to believe he's gone, but he is only gone in body, never in spirit. The empty space he left when he passed is now filled with fond memories and love. I miss him, but I know he will always be there.
Thank you for both of those. And as I said earlier, like Ron Kosman, Dean was somebody I knew fairly well. We'd co-authored publications. And importantly, at the last minute, he and Carol stepped in to fill a gap in the nearly finished Methods and Materials of Demography second edition, which I co-edited with Jay Siegel, a person who had been promising to finish the tough chapters on methods and stable population and stationary populations. At the last minute, when I pressed him, said, well, I can't do it. And the only other person I could think of that might be able to do it was Dean. And knowing Dean and Carol, I contacted them. And after a brief discussion, they said they'd do it. And they did it knowing that we had a tight deadline to try and get the book to the publisher. I was so appreciative of his work, and I think that by itself was a great service that both Dean and Carol did to the field as a whole. Thank you. Next, we have up John Riddell. I believe Bill Fry is on site, and he's going to say a few words about John.
Yeah, I'm here to talk about John Nodell. I'm pinch hitting for my colleague Ren Farley, who was not able to be here, and so most of my remarks were put together by Ren. John Nodell died at the age of 83 on January 10th in Ann Arbor. He changed the way demographers think about fertility change, HIV/AIDS, aging, historical demography, and mixed methods research, and paved the way for future scholars to study demography in Southeast Asia. John got his degree in demography from Princeton in 1965. After a few years of working for a short time at Rutgers University, Brown University, and the Population Council, he came to the University of Michigan in 1975 and became a professor in the sociology department of the Population Studies Center, and stayed there until he active until he retired in 2004, but actually he's remained active since. He also, for over 40 years, became affiliated with the Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, with a long career working in Thailand and Southeast Asia. John's mentor at Princeton was Ansley Cole, well known, of course, for lots of things, but he led the European Fertility Project and liked to encourage a lot of his students to do work in Europe. John decided to go to Germany and look at the historical fertility transition in Germany. Two books were important from that work: The Decline of Fertility in Germany, 1871 to 1939, which is based on official statistical sources, and Demographic Behavior of the Past, which analyzed family reconstruction data from German village genealogies. Around 1970, Ansley Cole persuaded John to do some work in Thailand on fertility with the Population Council, beginning a very long relationship John had with his colleagues in Bangkok and Thailand and the rest of Southeast Asia, including his continued affiliation with Chulalongkorn University. He focused on fertility decline in Thailand when he joined the University of Michigan, and a major outcome of that work was a classic study of fertility decline, Thailand's Reproductive Revolution, which was published in 1987. John paved the way for other scholars to initiate demographic research in formerly inaccessible countries in mainland Southeast Asia. He was instrumental in initiating the national surveys of older persons in Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar, and for opening channels for scholars from these countries, Thailand, and the U.S. to pursue collaborative and educational opportunities abroad. Much of John's work at the end of his career, toward the end of his career, dealt with issues related to aging in Southeast Asia, including the impact of rural-to-urban migration of adult children and older-age parents in Thailand, and he was especially interested in the impact of the AIDS epidemic on older generations, particularly in Thailand and Cambodia. John was named an honored member of the Population Association of America, where he served as vice president in 2002. The PAA recognized John as, quote, one of the earliest scholars to recognize and systematically investigate the extent and degree to which the elderly were being negatively impacted by HIV infections among their adult children, and how the demographic transition interacts with long-standing intergenerational support systems for older persons in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. He was also known for using qualitative as well as quantitative research, and the PAA award also mentions that population scientists now embrace qualitative methods as a major component of their methodological toolkit is due in large part to John's efforts to make such methods accessible and palatable to a field in which has a more quantitative orientation. John received an honorary doctorate degree at Chulalongkorn in 2015. He received an Excellence in Education Award at the University of Michigan College of Literature, Sciences, and the Arts. And he was very prolific not just the books that I mentioned. You can just, if you look him up, you can see many, many, many publications by himself and with collaborators. John enjoyed spending time in Ann Arbor and Bangkok. He was a dedicated vegetarian, an advocate for the humane treatment of animals. He loved bluegrass and conversations over beer. He had an adventurous mind. He traveled and tried new things with great enthusiasm. He is survived by his wife of 31 years and long-term collaborator Sean Penn. So I just want to add a few more personal notes. I first heard of John Nodell when I took my first job out of graduate school, which was at Rutgers University, to teach demography courses. The person who had that job before me was John Nodell, and he was sort of a legend there. People just kept talking about what a great person John was, what a great teacher he was. And soon enough, 9 years later, I got to be a colleague of John at the University of Michigan. And even more fortunate, I got to have an office right next to his for close to 21 years. This was a great honor for me, but also was very important for me, because John served in many ways as a more older faculty mentor. I wasn't in Ann Arbor for more than a week and a half, and he had me over to his house with some other people from the department. And all along, in my early years there, he taught me about, so the ins and outs of the department, the best journals to start putting my publications in. We would have lunch. We would play computer games after lunch. And the other thing he'd like to do is listen to bluegrass, as we mentioned here. He loved bluegrass. And we go to a place called the Ark in Ann Arbor with some other people quite frequently to listen to bluegrass. John, as I said, is also as it says, he was also very concerned about animal treatment. And one night after work, I saw John heading out dressed a little bit better than normal. And I said, "Where are you going, John?" He says, "I'm going to the Ann Arbor City Council meeting." And I said, "Well, what's that all about?" He says, "Well, there's these electrical wires that are killing pigeons near my house." I said, "John, why are you going out to do something like this?" He said, "Bill, it's better to make a big impact on a small issue than a small impact on a big issue." And he managed to be able to get that pigeon thing straightened out at the Ann Arbor City Council. So John really has been a very good colleague and friend to all of us. He was also a terrific teacher, and I could tell from having an office next to him for all those years how much the graduate students really loved working with him. I was an associate director for training for the PSC, Population Studies Center, for a few years. The students all wanted to work with John, so that was just a wonderful experience for them over time. So John has been a great scholar. His work will be known and remembered for historical work, his work in Southeast Asia, all the relationships and things that he's built there. But among those who know him very well, as a colleague, as a friend, as a teacher, he'll be very well missed.
Thank you, Bill. Any others who would like to say a few remarks about John?
I'll give a few personal remembrances of John. I'm Mark Van Landingham, and worked with John for several decades on a number of projects. Many people in the room will know his incredible academic contributions, but he was also a very interesting and generous man. And I was really impressed with him in many ways as a person. One was, as Bill mentioned, that how generous he was with his time, with me and with many other colleagues, that he worked with, especially in Southeast Asia. I was always really impressed with the extent to which he would spend a lot of time not only marking up manuscripts, but then explaining why he kind of thought it was better to do the way that he was suggesting. Some other memories are he really loved field work, and I really enjoyed going out with him in Thailand on many projects. And I was really impressed in one project where we were working on bereavement to older parents who had lost an adult child to HIV. And John kept a very demanding pace, where we had a lot of field work to do in a short period of time. And I remember, in some of the interviews where the older parent had become overwhelmed with grief and talking about the loss of the child, and John would insist that we pause and let the person grieve, and however long it took, to make sure that the respondent, the older parent, kind of got what they needed, and we kind of understood that it was not just data collection, but, there was a major loss, for this person also had a big impact on me that, these are people with lives and, yes, they're being very generous with their time, but also had gone through a lot, and we really needed to acknowledge that when we were in the field. You can tell from the expression on his face, John was a very playful individual, was very smart, had a really great sense of humor, and I was the victim of several practical jokes, some very sophomoric, some very elaborate, which usually involved exploiting my many weaknesses and giving me just enough rope to kind of hang myself, in a particular way. I think there are people laughing in the audience. I'm sure that I wasn't the only one who John enjoyed having a lot of fun with. And the last thing I'll say is that one of the major things he taught me is that that it's really important to try to do the scholarship as well as you can, but also to embrace life and have a really good time while you're doing it with your colleagues and your relationships, and pursued many other passions in life, and feel very fortunate to have known this remarkable man.
Thank you very much, Mark. Anyone else? All right, it's time
sorry,
to...
Dave.
I'm sorry?
Dave, it's Emily Agree. I just want to say something briefly about John.
Sure, please, Emily, go ahead.
So I knew John when I was a postdoc, Lindy was a postdoc, on working on the Aging in Asia project with John and with Al Hermelin. And the only thing that I can add to the many things that people have already said is that he was a model for doing cross-national research with colleagues in country, the kind of collaborative relationships that we were able to be a part of by being students and postdocs at that point really taught us how to develop the kind of collaborations that were equitable and sort of just in terms of the kind of research that could be done. And so it was such a tremendous learning experience, both scientifically and also as a way of working with people, that I will always remember.
Thank you, Emily.
May I?
Yes.
Jane Mencken. Two things about John. When I arrived at Princeton in 1969, John had just finished his PhD and he was teaching at Rutgers, but frequently back at OPR. John had an old car. I can't even remember the make, and I needed a car. So I bought John's car. About a week later, I pulled up the carpet in the front of the car, and you could see the road going by under the carpet. I said, John, what is this car? And he said, it works fine, Jane. What are you worrying about? And it did. It worked for the next 5 years. So that was John's car. And then long after that, my husband, Dick Jesser, and I had been in Vietnam, and we stopped in Thailand, in Bangkok, on the way back, and John and Sean Penn had invited us to dinner, and John said, I'll come pick you up at your hotel. What I didn't know at that point was that John was coming to pick us up in the boat from his apartment building, and so there we were, escorted onto this wonderful boat to go have dinner with wonderful John. And the memories of what a commitment he had to the development of demography in Thailand is truly inspiring for our field. And I, for one, will remember him forever.
Thank you, Jane. Others? If not, I think we'll go back to Emily, who's going to speak on behalf of Ken Mountain.
I was back at Duke a couple of weeks ago and found out that Ken Manton had passed away last year, and I wanted to have an opportunity to commemorate him as one of the founding fathers of the demography of aging and of biodemography. Now, there are many in demography now who don't really know Ken Manton's name and don't know much about him, and others may remember him only because of the very public scandal which ensued about 20 years ago when he was taken advantage of as his mental and physical health declined by two unscrupulous employees at Duke. They stole all of his assets and embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from the university in federal grants. I think it's fair to say that Ken never recovered from that, although he continued to do research as best he could. Thankfully for the field of demography of aging and biodemography, his colleagues at Duke, Jim Vopel, Ken Land, Eric Stollard, Anatoly Yashin, and others, were able to rebuild and revitalize demography at Duke and demography of aging, and it continues to be an important center for demographic research, especially in biodemography and aging. But I want to focus on the contributions that Ken made earlier in his career. He finished his PhD at Duke University after graduating with a BA from Princeton, and he then stayed on as a postdoc and then as a research professor at Duke for the rest of his career. He was astonishingly productive and published almost 500 articles over the course of his career. When I was a graduate student at Duke, Ken was a towering presence. He was large, not only in mind, but also in body. And maybe it's just because I'm one of the shorter people, but I just remember him being really big. He wasn't always easy to get to know, and he didn't work with students that much. I never worked with him. And we often saw him only late in the afternoon or evening because he tended to come in late and then work through the night, even back then. In the late 1970s, he partnered with Max Woodbury, who was a mathematician, on work that extended the concept of demographic frailty and developed its dynamic properties. This led to a foundational article co-authored with Jim Vopel and Eric Stollard, published in Demography, called The Impact of Heterogeneity in Individual Frailty on Dynamics of Mortality. The papers that he wrote then, including that 1979 article, were foundational to the development of the study of biodemography of aging, which at that point really was not a developed field. And for those of you that were around back then to realize that in the late 1970s, there was no demography of aging. Everything in PAA and demography was fertility, family planning, really focused on reproductive lives. And in the 1980s was when it really started to take off very much around the scholars at Duke like Ken, and Ken's work was really integral to it taking off. And so the papers that he wrote were really, they advanced the study of survival models and mortality by illustrating the interactions of survival with heterogeneous frailty distributions, fixed or dynamic, and sort of illustrating that. And those papers have been cited thousands of times, and I checked, and the 1979 paper has been cited 40 times since January 2024. So still 50 years later, still, a foundational work that people go back to. That work also led to his development of the theory of dynamic equilibrium, which he published in 1982 in a paper in Milbank, where he took on what was then a growing interest in James Free's compression of mortality theory, arguing that Free's simplistic assumptions about the independence of mortality and morbidity were not and could not explain old age mortality and the changes and trends in that mortality, but that it was a combination of delayed chronic disease, improved management, and the consequent changes in the severity and fatality of disease that could contribute to pushing morbidity and mortality curves in different relationships to each other, depending on the time, the medical breakthroughs, and the changes that were going on in the health of the population. Ken integrated a deep understanding of disease processes into his work, and he pushed for increasingly interdisciplinary approaches to demographic modeling that explicitly incorporated medical research and biomedical processes, working over the years with a wide assortment of colleagues on studies of specific disease processes and the implications of both real and potential medical breakthroughs. In 1982, he was also asked to begin the first longitudinal study of aging and disability, the National Long-Term Care Survey. At that point, again, we really had no comprehensive national data on disease and disability among the older population. So it was a groundbreaking endeavor and was for many years one of the most important sources of information that we had on aging and health. It was the basis for the beginning of his contributions to the study of trends in disability in later life, which became a huge focus of research of many studies during the 1990s. It opened the door for the Health and Retirement Survey and the family of HRS studies, as well as the National Health and Aging Trends Study, which is really the heir to the NLTCS now, to do longitudinal research on disability and health in later life. As a result of his work in 1990, Ken received the PAA's Mindel-Sheps Award for contributions to mathematical demography, and he was the first demographer of aging to be so honored. He was followed by Vopal, and he was followed by Yashin and others, but up until that point, no one who was doing that kind of research had actually been honored with an award like that. So, in commemoration of his contributions to demography, I want to recognize and commemorate Ken tonight.
Thank you, Emily. I can see Eric Steller is online, so I'm guessing that he would like to say a few words as well.
Hey, yeah, I was listening. I talked to Emily, or not talked to her, I emailed her several times before she did the presentation. I think she really covered the material very, very well. Can you all hear me?
Not well.
Turn up my volume here. Can you hear me good now?
That's better.
Accent. I'm not sure why the connection. Okay. Anyway, let me be brief. I thought that that Emily really captured the contributions that Ken had very well. I could just make a comment now. When I was doing my walk this evening, I was thinking if you all asked me to say something. I met Ken in 1972 at about 4 a.m. in the basement of the Computation Center at Duke. I was studying or working my computer model of Q factor analysis, and he was doing I'm trying to remember what a multivariate discriminant analysis. And we're the only two people who had any kind of connection with respect to that those topics, both complex multivariate procedures. I talked to him many times because I'd be there every night and he'd be there every night. And that went on for months. A year later, I was hired by his dissertation advisor, and we began a collaboration that went more than 35 years. He was a joy to work with. we had so many in-depth conversations. We got Max Woodbury involved, Jim Vopel involved, Anatoly Yashin, Ken Land. The conversations, they would start at about the time Ken would get in, lunchtime, maybe 2 in the afternoon would start, and a lot of times we'd be still going strong at 2 a.m. in the morning. It was a delight. If you can ever imagine having someone who is very was a sympathetico, whatever, or simpatico with you and can follow the most complex, convoluted thing. And then if you make a mistake, you can get Max Woodbury or Anatoly Yashin to say, no, there's a theorem that either supports or contradicts whatever you had. And we went like that for years and years and years. It was such a pleasure. I was thinking that goes all the way back 52 years ago now. So when I'm out on my walk, I just sort of pop up with these memories. And one of the things you can do after you're gone from this world is have people who fondly remember you. And that's how I remember Ken. So I'll stop there because my sound's not so good.
Thank you very much, Eric. Are there others who would like to say anything on behalf of Ken? If not, I believe we're going to move to Mary J. Hoeksema, who's going to say something about Catherine Wallman.
Thank you, David, for making room for me on the program to say a few words about my colleague and friend, Catherine Wallman. Catherine passed away on January 17th this year at the age of 80. Although Catherine was not a population scientist, she was very much a fixture in the population research community. Catherine began her career in federal statistics at the National Center for Education Statistics, NCES. From 1981 to 1992, she was the first executive director of the Council of Professional Associations on Federal Statistics. In 1992, she left COPAS and returned to federal service when she became the U.S. Chief Statistician and head of the Office of Management and Budget, Statistical and Science Policy Office, a post she held until her retirement in 2017. While at OMB, Catherine spearheaded numerous efforts that led, for example, to the implementation of the 2002 SIPSI law, which standardized confidentiality protection and information sharing by U.S. federal statistical agencies, as well as the revision of Statistical Policy Directive Number 15 in 1997. She also co-chaired a technical working group that led to the development of the Supplemental Poverty Measure. One thing I remember about Catherine, though, telling me she was most proud of was the role she played in the development of the Statistics in Schools program. Throughout her career, Catherine received numerous awards, including the 2011 PAA Excellence in Public Service Award. We honored her not just because of her leadership of the federal statistical system, but also because of her tireless engagement with the data user community. In retirement, Catherine devoted her time and energy to groups including the Census Project, American Statistical Association, which she had served as the president of in 1992, the Association of Public Data Users, the Council of the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research at the University of Michigan, and of course the PAA, where she was a very active member of the Committee on Population Statistics. In fact, I was with her 2 weeks before she died, in which she was at a COPS meeting. She chose to devote her time to these groups because they shared her commitment to preserving and strengthening the federal statistical system and its data. As she did through her career, she did in retirement. She graciously mentored colleagues in the public, private, nonprofit, and academic sectors, freely sharing her expertise with an unrivaled sense of style, grace, wit, candor, and humor. Besides being a consummate professional, Catherine was also a consummate host known for bringing people together over casual dinners and happy hours at her home in McLean. I consider myself so lucky to have been a guest at her home and to hear in her words stories of the Wallen Unleashed events that occurred during her years of public service. She is survived by her loving daughter Elizabeth and grandson Finn, and a vast circle of friends who are so grateful for her service. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary Jo. We appreciate your remarks on Catherine, who really was instrumental in the field in many ways that most of us don't even know about. Anyone else?
Yes, I'd like to say a few words.
Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Jennifer Park. I'm formerly from the Office of Management and Budget, and I served under Catherine Mollman. Mary Jo did such an excellent job describing Catherine's many contributions to U.S. statistics and demography, but I wanted to share with you all a bit of her contributions in the realm of international statistical collaboration, which she was particularly well suited. So that if you will bear with me, I'll read a few remarks. Catherine served as the chair of the Conference of European Statisticians, UN Economic Commission for Europe from 2003 to 2007. She served as a chair of the UN Statistical Commission, the highest body directing international statistical policy from 2004 to 2005. She served as vice chair of the Statistics Committee, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development from 2009 to 2011. She was an elected member of the International Statistical Institute, a founding member of the IAOS. Catherine was not the first American, nor the first woman to hold these positions, but she may have been the best. During her tenure, the international statistical system faced perhaps the greatest challenges of the era. Catherine met these challenges with integrity, grace, and wit. She championed the fundamental principles of official statistics, which first emerged to assist national statistical offices in forming their missions as they transitioned from centrally planned market economies, later becoming a unifier of official statistics across all UN recognized countries and endorsed by the highest body of the UN. In doing so, Catherine placed the role and responsibilities of official statistics squarely within policymaking. Catherine also lifted the international statistical community's response to providing indicators and statistics to the UN Millennium Development Goals and its successor, the Sustainable Development Goals. These enormous challenges to the organization, volume, complexity, sensitivity, and harmonization of international statistics inform global policies in such a way were unparalleled. It was Catherine's call for unity that calmed, encouraged, and fortified as all national statistical offices face these challenges together. But these positions of responsibility, even during exceptional times in our history, cannot possibly explain the respect, admiration, and friendship so many of her peers hold for Catherine. Long after her tenure, she remained a thought leader, a wise counsel, a trusted colleague. She served when few women led statistical policy, representing one of the most powerful countries in the world, which could be challenging at times. She was eager to travel and to learn about other cultures, but was not multilingual. What was her secret? The secret of Catherine's magic is both simple and extraordinary. As in all of our work, our efforts rest in our personal relationships with others. Catherine met other people where they were. She found shared values and goals. She believed in the best in everyone and expected it of herself and in others. In this belief, she found and shared delight, pride, strength, and courage. Catherine would not let you down, and shown that respect, none of us could let her down either. And together a way was found. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else want to speak on behalf of Catherine? If not, I believe we'll move on to Greg Robinson, who's on site, and he'll speak on behalf of the second Census Bureau retiree who passed, and that would be David Ward. Greg?
Hi. David was a demographer at the Census Bureau from 1996 to about 2006. And David was a great friend to many of us and well known for his eagle-eye ability to analyze the data and detect errors. And I reached out to 3 or 4 of his colleagues who were more than happy to provide some remembrances of Dave, and I'll read those. First from Signer Wettergen, who worked about the same years as Dave from 1966 to 2006. Here's what Signer said. Dave and I first met when I began my census career in June 1967. I think Dave already had been working there for maybe less than a year. Dave worked in the estimates area under Don Starsinik at the time. He probably worked on state estimates. He worked in the estimates area and then worked with Dick Owen in various areas. Names I'd forgotten, but were well known to the Bureau. Dave always was one that if he suspected something didn't look right with an estimate result, he would grind down until he spotted the issue and cause. He wouldn't give up until he identified what was going on. Dave was known for that eagle eye. I think he also did some work on the early results from the ACS. I know you did some digging into the ACS results, but I thought Dave did that as well. I don't remember, but did Dave also suspect there was duplicates in the census results? He was right. I'm not sure if the search was duplicates in census led work on the names issue, identifying the most common first names in the census. I think Dave was one of the first ones to detect the problems we have with duplicates. Bob Kaminsky, another colleague of Dave, and provided some nice notes. This is Bob talking about Dave. When I picked up the names project from him, a lot of the foundational work had been done, but Dave kept finding other avenues of analysis to pursue. A big part of my job was to scale the project to bring it to closure. Dave was always following the next lead. In the realm I dealt with the most, our baseball stat league, Dave was much like he was at work, thorough, thoughtful, and detail-driven, always looking for the outlier issue or problem. His teams were routinely among the best in the league, partnering with Jeff Passell and later Bob Nunziata. Despite the contrariness he brought to many conversations, he was always a deeply inquisitive and thoughtful person. I truly wish there was in some way a Bureau could have better utilized folks like him in retirement. He took great pride in being thorough and trying to ensure the quality of his work, something that seems to be missing a lot these days. And he understood the value of dynamic collegiality and the value of having people in the room who did not see things as everybody else. Dave was always an interesting guy, and that's so true. And Bob Nunziata, remembrances. Bob's still working at the Census Bureau, and doing well. I was fortunate enough to have worked alongside Dave on the 1990 and 2000 decennial censuses, as well as working together on the demographic aspects of surnames from Census 2000 report. I could always marvel at how quickly he could spot an error in an otherwise sea of numbers, or how he'd recall an obscure fact that would shed light on solving a problem. He possessed a keen eye for detail and was analytical with everything he approached. On a more personal note, Dave was quite a talker. He had the ability to talk to anyone on just about any topic. Many in his golf league said his surname should have been paragraph instead of word. That was a compliment. That was a compliment because Dave I had so many conversations with Dave. Oh, Dave would have trouble right now if he was still working the Bureau. The Bureau's been out of the office for 4 years now. Dave thrives in talking to people, and he was so unique. Dave is like a dear friend and will be missed. And and I won't go through as much because we're out of time, but I kept touch with Dave. We'd go on, talk on the phone every once in a while. In fact, I remember he retired in about 2006, and he was so passionate about the data. And it was the time of the 2010 census. It was still, we released the census results always at the last end of December of the year of, but starting in about July, August, September or so of 2010, Dave would call, "Come on, Greg, what's the number?" Right. He wanted to know what the count was. Like, Dave, I can't tell you what the number was, but yes, it was really amazing. But I just put some notes here in one of my last conversations with Dave. We talk every once in a while, and he had such a mind. Again, he'd been retired. This one in March of 2022, Dave had been retired for 16 years, and all these questions, these technical notes he had on Dave. Dave wants to say, after my conversation, I wrote down some notes because this guy's amazing. Dave wants to see the 2020 DA component-based estimates for ages 65 to 84 compared to the independently derived 2020 Medicare data. This is good, but we haven't done that yet, so why not publish, and there's another one, he's big on older ages. Why don't we do more for older ages? Why not publish and release DA estimates to 100 plus in 2020? The estimates do. If concerns about size, collapse to 5-year age groups. And the absolute size of these older ages is larger than the population supporting the DA estimates for ages under 85 and earlier censuses. So he had a point. Do it. And another really technical, but remember Dave's been retired for 16 years and he talks about demographic analysis. Dave notes that an age 73 anomaly in the DA estimates is still there, I think. Eric Jensen here for you to see it, but here's the read. An age 73 anomaly in DA estimates undercount while adjacent ages show overcounts. And this cohort pattern is seen in the DA estimates for ages 63 in 2010, 53 in 2000, cohort effect. The cause is a misallocation of deaths in the months of 1946, where births in July, December were 30% higher than births in January, June. And so, some of this is also like because the births starting in July, the baby, war was over and people came back, and the births. The cause was the misallocation of deaths in the months of 1946, where births in July and December were 30% higher than births in January, June. So with linear allocation of deaths each month, like the 4-1-1946, 4-1-1947 cohort is not assigned enough deaths in each year forward. So a greater proportion of the calendar deaths need to be assigned in April, December. He's been retired for 16 years, and he still has his mind for 10. Dave was amazing. So I'll just finish with that, but Dave was a unique guy, and we miss him. Oh, and one thing, so some good reports. This is a classic. Right? This was in 1989, the first time ever the Census Bureau releases pop estimates by race and Hispanic origin for states and metro areas. This is a classic, 1040, I knew this. P25 1040, it sure was. I remember that report. And he's big on surnames, building a Spanish surname list. One of the first times that was really done. He's big on names. And then still a classic. Who responds, who doesn't? Analyzing variations in male response rates during the 1990 census. He looked at response rates and cross-classified by race and origin, by household composition, by whether you were an owner or a renter, and relationship, spouse, single, and found some really interesting patterns. And it's just, not all of this has been done since then, but Dave, with a sharp mind, he was always interested in the data, and as I said again, we miss him.
Greg, thanks very much for remembering Dave. As a member of the cohort birth group that Dave worked on, I can say we were problematic for everything, but it's good to know that we've generated problems with the demographic analysis approach to estimating census accuracy. Is there anybody else who would like to speak on behalf of Dave Word? If not, I'll bring this to a close. I want to thank everybody who contributed their thoughts to this. Our fallen colleagues and comrades were amazing people. It's wonderful for me to hear about them. I really appreciate the effort put into it. I appreciate the effort, as we all should, of the PAA staff who've done the work to set this all up, and for the PAA for holding this kind of a session to begin with. I would like to say also the records that are being kept of this, I think will go to the historical record, and I think that's another important piece for a PAA. Thank you very much.